Thank you. For today's meeting, if you need a better meeting experience or need assistance with interpretation, we have Spanish and American Sign Language available. To access those items, simply navigate to the bottom of the screen and click Interpretation. And select ASL under Watch or Spanish under Audio. If the interpretation icon isn't available on your screen, try clicking the More icon, which is 3 dots in a circle. While we're in discussion today, we recommend that folks use the gallery view so that we can see the faces of the folks participating with us. And as always, TAG is available for technical support. Simply open the chat window, select TAG as your recipient, and send your message. I'd like to reiterate that questions are welcome at any time, but we'd like folks to remain muted on the line unless they are speaking. And if you'd like to jump into today's conversation, please use the raise hand in the toolbar. Today we have two great folks that will be leading the conversation, Lee Elder and Robert Warren. And so I believe we'll pass the baton to you now, Lee, as we move this forward.
Thanks, Jeffrey. Appreciate that. Good afternoon, everyone. Lee Elder here. This is our second vulnerable population workshop, and we intend to get a little bit deeper into some of the ideas that we've been contemplating with regard to vulnerable population geographic designation. Specifically, today we want to talk about settlement condition 14 and the vulnerability factors that were provided to us as part of those settlement conditions. We also want to review our initial approach to designating census tracts as being vulnerable. And as we're going through this, our proposed geographic vulnerable population approach, we also want to hear from you, obviously. So with that, let's proceed to the next slide. So before we get going, we wanted to kind of touch on what we talked about back in our first vulnerable population workshop back in June. This slide provides a reminder of that. So in that conversation, we introduced CBI settlement condition 14. We also discussed some of the different factors that were provided to us as part of that settlement condition. We had a conversation with regard to our current vulnerable population approach. And we also had some discussion revolving around highly impacted communities. And finally, what we did is we did a compare and contrast between what we're currently doing around vulnerable populations, Pacific Corp's currently doing, versus what other utilities have been, our peer utilities in Washington have been doing in this space. So with that, let's proceed to the next slide, please. So out of that conversation, we heard a few things, and we wanted to at least document them here. We paraphrased the conversations and the input we received. So one thing that we heard was there may be issues with using a survey to track impacts on small populations, response rate, survey implementation, and other items. Another item that we heard, another comment that we heard in that conversation in our first vulnerable population workshop was Pacific Power should not have to choose one methodology or the other. Some factors are better tracked geographically while others are tracked via surveying efforts. Another comment was the method of locating vulnerable populations does not matter as much as the impact of our policy. And the geographic target area should be scaled to the level of investment. And then finally, one of the other major themes was being too granular with geographic vulnerable populations may not be worthwhile due to Pacific Power's small service area. So we generally agree with all this, all the comments, feedback we received in the first workshop. Today, the center of the conversation is really going to be focused on the items around, geographic approach. There's 2 or 3 on this particular slide that touch on that. But yeah, the conversation today is centered around geographic approach. So let's proceed to the next slide. So given the feedback that we received from interested parties and the direction that we've been provided to us through settlement 14, condition 14, we're proposing here today to use a geographic approach to identifying vulnerable populations. Some of the benefits of doing that are laid out here on the slide, but just in summary, we're able to better assess how an area is vulnerable when looking at multiple factors. So that would provide a more easy way to determine whether or not, streamlined way to determine whether an area is vulnerable. It also will allow us to focus our efforts as a company and actions that we undertake as part of our CEIP, focus those efforts into areas that more that need it, more intensive need in those particular areas. And it's also going to be easier for us to identify the impacts on the back end of after we implement a certain action that we've increased or improved the outcomes in a particular area. So today we are proposing to make that switch to a geographic approach. And also, before we really get into it, kind of want to take, in a nutshell, what did we do? We conducted an initial stab at geographic vulnerable population analysis, which can be characterized in 4 buckets, 4 bullets. We took a look at the settlement vulnerability factors and what we've the existing vulnerable population data that we've been compiling for the last 3 or so years. We went through, after we assessed that information, we went through a massive data collection effort to obtain the data that we needed to obtain on a geographic level. We then aggregated that data into composite scores based on those vulnerability factors. And then we determined what areas census tracts were deemed to be a vulnerable location. So let's proceed to the next slide. And also, before we really get into, the methodology, I think it's also quite helpful to talk about, kind of table set about our service territory, service area in Washington. We have approximately 114,000 residential customers in Washington. Our service area is primarily in Yakima and Walla Walla, but we do also have a service area that extends into Benton, Columbia, Garfield, and Kittitas counties. But the bulk of our service area is Yakima and Walla Walla. And when you start looking at the demographics of our service area, you can see that, especially compared to statewide, overall statewide values, you can see that, our service area has a much higher concentration of Hispanic or Latino persons. There's a lot more people that speak languages other than English at their homes. There's quite a bit higher level of impoverished or poverty in our service territory. And then also there's a much higher concentration of people that work in the natural resource sectors. So agriculture, forestry, fishing, hunting, and mining, relative to comparing to the statewide proportions. So just wanted to set the table, provide a little bit more context there. A lot of folks on the phone probably know that, but I find it helpful. Next slide, please. Oh, next one after this. Also, we took a page out of the existing highly impacted community approach. For those that might not know, the Washington Department of Health has created an analysis that identifies particular census tracts in our service territory as being highly impacted communities. And we have not deviated much from that particular approach in what we're proposing here today. And we thought it prudent to at least discuss it briefly to give some context that, hey, so this isn't totally a new construct that we're implementing here. It's been done before, and it was done, I want to say roughly 3 years ago at the onset of the CEIP process. So Washington Department of Health, what they had done to determine whether or not an area is highly impacted is that they looked at 19 sets of criteria, 19 criteria, which could be characterized in those 4 buckets that you see there on the bottom left-hand side of the slide. So they would either be an environmental exposure criteria, environmental effects criteria, sensitive populations criteria, or socioeconomic factor. And what they did is they aggregated those scores and did a percentile or decile ranking approach to determine which particular census tracts were either a 9 or a 10. And if they scored a 9 or a 10, they were deemed to be a highly impacted community. Now, in some circumstances, regardless of how a particular census tract scored using that methodology, if that census tract was located in on a reservation or tribal lands, it was automatically deemed to be highly impacted. So we think it's prudent to discuss that here because it's very similar to the approach that we're proposing here today. So with that, let's proceed to the next slide. And this gets into the meat of it. So our proposed vulnerable population geographic approach, what we did is we, circling back to the data collection effort, we collected data for information for 32 separate criteria, vulnerability factors that are flowing into our analysis. And when we did that, we had to take a look at whether or not it was important, once you aggregate that information or aggregate that data across all 32 criteria for a composite score, that the directionality was being correctly accounted for in the math. So, if folks in an area or a census tract, the proportion of folks did not have access, low instance of internet accessibility, that's actually a vulnerability. We wanted to make sure that that was reflected as being a high number, and we had to make sure that the math worked for the composite scoring. So we took a look at that, make sure that was all lined up correctly. Again, we collected all this information for all the approximately 1,500 census tracts throughout the state of Washington, 32 separate variables. We created a composite score for across all 32 criteria for each census tract. And then we did a rank scoring approach to determine which ones scored the highest all the way through the lowest. And then we applied the decile approach. So scores of 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way up to 10. And if a census tract scored as a 9 or 10, we deem that to be a vulnerable population geography. And in the instance of that census tract being located on tribal lands or being located in a qualified census tract or located in a highly distressed community, they were automatically promoted to a 10 and considered to be a vulnerable population geography. The definitions of all that is on the right-hand side, the qualified, the QCTs and the EDCs. The definitions of those are provided on the right-hand side of the slide. But at any rate, unlike HICs, this approach considered all the different criteria, the 32 separate criteria that we're using in the analysis, we consider them to be of equal weight. There were, in the HIC approach, they assigned weighting for some of the criteria that have a little bit of a higher weight than others. But for this, we assumed all of them to have equal weights. Next slide, please. Okay, so this slide provides, bear with me for a moment. This slide provides our vulnerable populations, which is not a new list. It's been with us for a number of years now. We've, as an outcome from having conversations with our interested parties, with stakeholders, with numerous folks, our advisory groups, this is the list of vulnerable populations or in our service territory that we wanted to consider as being vulnerable. And we wanted to make sure that given all the input that we received over the years that, this did not get, that this took, that this was considered in our analysis for a vulnerable population geographic approach. And so what you see here is text that is highlighted as, in blue has been explicitly included in our analysis for the vulnerable populations geographic approach. Whereas you'll see some text that is in black font. So the ones that are in black font are ones we want to have a little bit more of a further discussion about here today, a little bit more conversation around them. In some instances, we think that we're actually capturing them in the approach we've taken. In others, we are having difficulty in getting the data to include in the analysis. And yeah, anyway, I'll just read some of those and then we'll jump into these in the next slide. So vulnerable population 6, people with medical equipment at home. Vulnerable population 9, asset limited, income constraint, employed, aka Alice. Vulnerable population 10, low income migrants. Vulnerable population 17, people experiencing homelessness. And vulnerable population 19, people living in different land statuses, either trust or fee land. With that, let's proceed to the next slide. So for further consideration, discussion, this slide provides some of the items we want to discuss. Vulnerable population 6, people with medical equipment at home. The issue that we are running into is that we are having some real difficulty in getting a data set that explicitly provides the number of people that have medical equipment at home on a geographic basis throughout the state of Washington. And we believe that we are reasonably capturing this particular, reflecting the population of interest here through some of the other metrics that we're including in our analysis. We believe that, vulnerable population 4, hearing impairment, touches on this. Vulnerable population 5, disability, is also touching on this. Settlement vulnerability factor 2, cardiovascular disease, which is a consideration in our approach here, is being reflected. Settlement vulnerability factor 3, low birth weight, and then settlement vulnerability factor 11, access to healthcare. All these particular factors are being included in our analysis. And we feel like they are touching on what's being asked, touching on folks with medical equipment at home. I do see a question that came through.
Correct.
I might pause for that.
Yeah. Kathleen asks, what about people on supplemental oxygen?
I mean, that's certainly a consideration. That's something that might come through in terms of, the ACS data that we're acquiring on a census tract basis for disabled disability. So there's a proportion of the population through the U.S. Census Bureau that, here's how many people in a particular census tract are estimated to have a disability. I would have to dig into that definition of disability to see whether or not it actually includes people that are on supplemental oxygen. I don't know for a fact if it does or does not at the moment. I don't know. Kathleen, anything else on that one? I certainly can look into it. I will, but I just don't know right now off the top of my head.
Yeah, no, I just asked that because that is often an issue in power outages, that people who are dependent on supplemental oxygen have problems getting their oxygen and they need that power. So sometimes we really need to understand that segment of the population.
Okay. I'll take a note on that and see if we can circle back to you on an answer there. Okay. Charlie, I see a hand.
Yeah, hi Lee. Thanks. This is Charlie Thompson with the Northwest Energy Coalition. Um, you might have already mentioned this, but I was kind of curious. I know that the IOUs in Washington report on the customers they have with medical certificates, and I was curious how those customers might be incorporated into this vulnerable population data set, if you know.
I don't know about what Avista or PSC is doing in that space.
Sure, just Pacific Core.
Yeah, for Pacific Corp, we are, we're including, so for VP6, we are proposing that, we're counting for hearing impairment, which is something that's tracked by ACS. That's what we're pulling into the analysis. Disability is also tracked by the ACS. Cardiovascular disease, I want to say, I might have to phone a friend on that. Is that from Department of Health, Robert?
Yes, we obtained yeah, sorry. Yeah, we obtained that information from the Department of Health.
Thank you. And then low birth weight, I also want to say it's Department of Health, and access to healthcare, Department of Health also subject to check. So we don't have anything per se for medical, what was it again? Medical certificates?
Certificates, yeah, just customers for medical certificates.
I can take a note there and see what we can do around that. I honestly don't know where to even start. I'd have to look into it.
Yeah, okay, yeah, and I asked because, and honestly, I don't know what it means, like what the qualification is for a customer to have to report that they have a medical certificate. I know it relates to like if they can enroll in bill assistance and different things like that. It's in Pacific Core's COVID docket reporting in docket 200281, I believe. And then yeah,
Okay.
I was curious because maybe
All right. So that
customer, sorry.
no, you finish. I'm sorry. I don't want to jump over.
No
Go ahead.
worries, yeah.
You finish. Yeah.
Kathleen's question made me think about that. Like, oh, I wonder if people who report having a medical certificate, if one of the qualifications is needing supplemental oxygen or something like that, and if that's an easy way for Pacific Core to overlap data they already have with these other medical related vulnerability factors. So just curious. Thank you guys.
Yeah, I think what you described there kind of made me think of, if something's reported to the company in terms of like a medical need reported to our billing department, that might be something we can look into. But I have to take a look at that to see if that's available. And then in addition to that statement, we don't want to double count here, I guess, is my concern. That I need to look at the data first and then make an assessment, or at least make a recommendation to folks on the phone in our next meeting about it, whether or not it should be included, or here's what that does to the math. Are we double counting it elsewhere, sort of thing. But yeah, I'll take that back. I appreciate it, y'all.
Thanks, Lee.
Yep. For vulnerable population 9, ALICE status, the issue that we're running up against digging into this is that the data is really incomplete for the state, statewide. When you do a statewide percentile ranking approach, you look to have data statewide, and we're only able to find the data set that we can get our hands on has only 240-ish census tracts out of the 1,500 or so census tracts in the state of Washington. So we think that we are reasonably measuring ALICE through vulnerable population 11 low income. For vulnerable population 10 low income migrant, we believe there's no data set that explicitly has identifies low income migrants, but we do have vulnerable population 11 low income and vulnerable population 12, which is immigrant. So we feel like we are reasonably capturing that particular vulnerable population with our approach here. Vulnerable population 17 is people experiencing homelessness, which has been a it's been a difficult one from the onset, to be frank, to get data around homelessness in our service area. It just does not exist, and what's available is not available at the census tract level. So we are proposing to exclude that particular vulnerable population from this geographic analysis because the data simply does not exist at the granularity that we need it. And then for vulnerable population 19, different land statuses, we were having some difficulty getting ownership data. So this particular census tract, this particular vulnerable population was identified as an issue in terms of trust and fee land ownership, and implications on energy efficiency or the efficiency of particular homes. And at any rate, we were having some hard times finding the information we needed to find around ownership and whether or not it's on fee or trust land. Since we've developed this deck and developed the methodology, it's come to light that we can get some information from the Yakima County Assessor's Office, and we have some ideas about how to get this incorporated for the next iteration of this methodology. And
Lee,
Jeffrey,
I'm gonna pause you. There's another question in the chat from Elijah who asks, what about homeless shelters?
Yeah, hey Lee, I was just, not to go back, I was just thinking about the tracking folks experiencing homelessness, and if you could get numbers on the sort of density or location of shelters.
That might be a good idea. And no, don't apologize about going back. I appreciate you going back. So homeless shelters, I can certainly think about that. So does that Robert, did we peek at, and I asked Robert this question because he's on my team and he's been helping me with this analysis and he's been doing a lot of great work. So Robert, I apologize for phoning a friend again, but has homeless shelters come across our data grab to your knowledge?
No, not so much.
Okay.
Not like actual buildings themselves. Usually it's a person count.
Okay. That's something, Elijah, we'll take that back too. I appreciate that.
Yeah, and you might want to consider other just sort of service providers more broadly. Since I don't have anything to back this up, but just from folks I know who work with homeless populations, that's a fairly good indicator of where people will be a lot of the time. Not always, of course, so but something to consider.
Okay. Very helpful. Thank you. Okay, let's proceed to the next slide. All right, so keeping the same theme as we had for the vulnerable population slide, this slide is getting into the settlement vulnerability factors that were provided to us as part of settlement 14, or condition 14. Again, we have a number of settlement factors that are highlighted blue, which means we've been able to explicitly include those in the proposed vulnerable population geographic analysis, whereas the ones that are in black font are the ones that we want to give a little extra consideration to here today. So let's, well, maybe before I go, so we have vulnerability factor disability is one we want to talk more about. Home care, number 5, is another. Housing burden, number 8. Number 10, number 12, educational attainment levels. Number 13, historical redline influence. Number 23, areas identified as high need or underserved. And then number 24, areas with average energy burden greater than or equal to 6% with annual income less than 200% of federal poverty level. So with that, let's dive into some of the stuff we want to talk about these. So for vulnerability factor 1 disability, that was identified in the conditions, and we want to just note that we've already we feel like we're covering this one pretty well already with the vulnerable populations data that we're collecting for this analysis and incorporating into the analysis. We have vulnerable population 5 disability, and then also vulnerable population for people who have a hearing impairment. So we feel like we're already capturing this well with our approach. For SVF, vulnerability factor 8, housing burden, we are proposing to exclude this explicitly because we are already capturing it as a component of SVF vulnerability factor 22, housing quality. Housing quality is made up of 4 characteristics go into that calculation, of which 1 is housing burden. So it's already being captured in the analysis as part of housing quality. Educational attainment level, also identified as a condition vulnerability factor. We're already measuring that as our vulnerable population 1 housing with our households with a high school diploma or lower educational attainment. We're already capturing that. For vulnerability factor 13, we've ran historical red line influence. We've ran into a data availability issue with this one. The only available data sets for the state of Washington include Puget Sound, the area around Puget Sound, and then also Spokane. It's currently not available for all states of Washington, and the University of Washington and the University of Richmond are in the process of creating a more robust GIS layer for this for other areas. And we will get that incorporated into our analysis once it becomes available, but it just simply does not exist at this time. So for SVF 23, vulnerability factor 23 is identified in a condition list. Areas identified as highest need or underserved. So the request for the condition was to incorporate this into our analysis for determining areas that are vulnerable. We see that as being, this particular one as being a kind of a cart before the horse issue. The biennial conservation plan, which defines highest need and underserved, relies on the results from our CEIP process to identify what they even consider to be highest need or underserved. So the biennial conservation plan would consider HICs to be an area of highest need or underserved. And depending on the outcome of these conversations and results from this methodology update, I would see that this would be adopted. The results from this effort would be adopted by the biennial conservation plan as also being high need or underserved. So we don't see a reason to include this particular one in the analysis because it's circular. We would hope that this analysis would go to serve the biennial conservation plan once it becomes available. So for SVF 24, areas with average energy burden greater than or equal to 6% with annual incomes less than 200% of federal poverty. We are already measuring this as part of vulnerable population 8, energy burden, and also vulnerable population 11, low income. As for vulnerability factor 5, home care, we are struggling with 2 main things. One, we're struggling with a definition issue. We're having a hard time really identifying what home care means. And then on top of that, our interpretation of it, we're having a hard time finding data that would fit that. So in my mind, home care would be live-in or partial care at your own home. But that data does not exist. We are not able to track that data and find that data to use in this analysis. But it could mean folks living or in hospice. It could mean people needing professional or family care, people in retirement homes or nursing homes, counts of long-term care facilities by census tract. So I guess my question to the group is what makes what makes the most sense for us to track? Or like, what would we want to define home care as? You know, people that are in home care include this kind of, you know, so we can actually grab this data. I will offer up that we are tracking things that touch on this, and that's in the right-hand side of this slide. So, you know, similar populations that we are measuring at the moment that touch on home care would be, you know, vulnerable population 2, older adults, BP4 hearing impairment, BP5 disabilities, VP vulnerable population 15, which is multi-generation households, vulnerable populations with, you know, cardiovascular disease, low birth weight, higher rates of hospitalization, and access to healthcare. So we have a lot of like health criteria already factoring into the analysis. But at any rate, we're struggling with how to define this, and the you know, my interpretation of it, live in or partial care at your own home, the data simply does not exist. So interested to hear thoughts. Don't need to hear them now. We're going to have a survey at the end of this conversation and this presentation that folks can fill out at their discretion to think about it a little bit more. But we would love to hear some thoughts around, hey, Pacific Corp, you seem like you're touching on this with these particular criteria or not, or just anything you have to offer. Charlie, I see your hand.
Oh, I was just giving a thumbs up because I was
Oh.
also trying to think about this, and I appreciate the post meeting survey on this.
Yeah, it's tough to, yeah. Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, I appreciate it. It's tough to think through some of the stuff that, you know, me and my team have been looking at for a few weeks, months, and expect to have an answer. So just take interested in your feedback when you're able to get around to it.
Yeah. And Lee, while I guess steal the mic back, but while I have the mic, thanks so much for laying out I think it's been very helpful to see how the settlement vulnerability factors and the vulnerable population factors that Pacific were identified in these past few slides. It's been looking, it's been easy to follow, like why certain ones have been included and what issues that you're struggling with. So, and then like I said, it'll be great to have that post meeting survey to offer some feedback, because this is a lot of information, but a lot of very helpful information. So thanks. I know it's a lot to parse through and to figure out what is you know, trying not to overlap things or double count things. And admittedly, NWEC, my organization, was one that pushed for this condition that had the settlement vulnerability factors that you're looking at. So thanks so much for being so diligent with the work to include these and to assess them with the folks here.
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. It's never easy to talk through this, you know, data. I admit that. I know I get asked to do it a lot, but it's really, you know, when it's I appreciate y'all sticking with me to talk through it, because we've been wrestling with it and trying to figure out how to incorporate it and best represent it. So anyway, thank you, Charlie. Let's go to the next slide. So we've taken the pen to compile, in light of all the things we've defined or discussed here so far, to say, all right, well, what's this look like if we push it through, and we do the analysis and consider these criteria to be you know, something we want to look at and consider in a vulnerable population geographic approach. And that's what you're seeing here. The yellow ones, the yellow census tracts are the HIC, the census tracts that have been designated as highly impacted communities. We have 20 of those in our service area in Washington. And when you look at the results of what we've described so far today, you go through that entire process. 35 of the census tracts out of our total 61 end up being considered a vulnerable population based on the criteria we've already discussed. General takeaways of that approach is that if you're an HIC, you tend to be very likely you're going to be a vulnerable population. We end up with, you know, a lot of the resulting vulnerable population geographies are also HICs. There's only one exception to that, and it's in the north western corner of Walla Walla service area. But by and large, all of you are if you're HIC, you're a vulnerable population based on our approach. And the other takeaways I would offer up would be that those census tracts in the Sunnyside area, which is in the south eastern portion of the Yakima area, those ended up being vulnerable, whereas they were not HICs in that particular construct. And then the urban center of Walla Walla, those, I want to say there's like 6 census tracts in that area that ended up becoming that are vulnerable, and they are not HICs. That's kind of the high level takeaways I would offer. And then let's go ahead and move to the next slide. It shows a little bit more granularity. So like I said, we had 20 census tracts. First column there shows you the HIC census tracts by county. We have 20 in total, of which primarily Yakima with 19 census tracts that meet that definition. And then for Walla Walla, we only had 1 that was a HIC. Now, when we layer in our vulnerable population geographic approach and look at the resulting census tracts that meet that definition based on those criteria, we end up with 26 census tracts in Yakima that are vulnerable, 6 in Walla Walla that are vulnerable, and Garfield, Kittitas, and Columbia each have 1. Overall, if you look at it as if, you know, depending on, so if this, I got to say this right, if there are 36 census tracts in our service area that are either a HIC or a VP. That's the way, and out of this total 61. Interesting results. And maybe I'll pause there and let folks ask any questions they might have. Okay. Well, I think, let's go to the next slide. Another way of looking at this is, so if you were to look at our customers that live in an HIC, and you look at that, the total number of people that are customers that we would consider to be vulnerable under that definition would be 31,000 customers. And if you were to look at the number of customers that that live in a census tract that meet the definition of being vulnerable based on the criteria we just discussed, it'd be nearly 56,000 customers. So we are, when you expand the criteria, consider more items, because there was only 19 criteria considered under the HIC approach, and we're considering 32. It expands the number of people that we would consider to be vulnerable in our service area. And let's see, next slide. Oh, we're in the discussion question portion of the presentation. So maybe I'll just, do I toss this over to eSource?
Yeah, thanks, Lee.
Yep.
So as we go into this discussion portion, I think it's been great that we've gotten the questions thus far. I think we want to just pause for a moment and really ensure that we're getting feedback on these 3 questions. So we'll start with the first one for the group. Do the vulnerability factors considered in the proposed geographic analysis reflect the sensitivity factors that need to be accounted for? So I know we've had some questions about some sort of other data sets. I'm curious if what folks on the line like to share, and they can do so via chat or by raising their hand or just coming off mute.
No questions.
No comments. So
No
maybe
comments, I should say. Yeah.
So maybe the flip's way to think about this is what's missing from the vulnerability factors. There were a couple that were brought up. Are there any that folks would like to think about, or that we need to think about differently?
And I'll circle back. You know, I'll interject here, kind of back to my prior comment. You know, there is a lot to digest here, a lot, admittedly. So if you don't have anything now, please take a moment after the meeting to look through this, think about it a little bit more, and you know, go to that survey and provide us some feedback in there. We would very interested to hear anything you might have to offer. So, but interested to hear it
Kathleen,
now
I see
too.
you came
So.
off mute and raised your hand physically.
Yes. Thank you for this hard work. It's really impressive, and I'm floored by it. One thing that I have with some other work that I'm doing, one thing that we need to take into account, I think we do, is not just these kind of factors, but also the inequity in access to the benefits that other people in our state are accessing. I think about the benefits of solar and not having certain kinds of electricity, the benefits of clean water, some things that a lot of us take for granted. So we're seeing things like, you know, the negative sides of vulnerability, but there's positives that a lot of vulnerable communities are not accessing. I maybe I'm not expressing this quite right, but there's whenever I go to Eastern Washington, I live in Olympia, I'm always struck by the lack of solar power. I'm struck by you know, there's chemical fertilizers being applied, which to me says there's going to be runoff into the creeks and the streams and things like that. So that's going to get into water supplies. So some of the benefits of modern life that we take for granted are also not being shared equally. And how do we capture that? Not just what do they lack, but how do they not participate in the benefits?
So, Kathleen, you mentioned solar power, not having solar power once or twice. And then what was the other one? It was
clean water.
Clean water.
And that would especially affect migrant communities. And you know, I know some of that might get taken into some of these clean air, I'm guessing, is in some of these in pollution.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure we capture clean water as much as we do in air quality.
Okay. We'll take those comments back, Kathleen, and I'll yeah, we're gonna have another meeting on this to discuss, the feedback we received today and the feedback we received from surveys, and bring it forth, talk a little bit more about it. But I'll make sure that yeah, thank you for the feedback. We'll get that looked into.
Thank you, Kathleen. Are there other comments that folks would like to share on that first question about what's included or excluded?
Sorry, I'm not raising my hand. Come off
It's
video.
a-okay, Elijah. Jump on in.
Elijah, and I have you on a different screen, so I'm gonna look weird. But I was also thinking, and as Kathleen was speaking, that to add to that, if you can access data on whether folks have heating and cooling systems, that'd be an especially useful additional data set to see where there could be targeted investment in heat pump technology, and some of those incentives for energy efficiency, and especially just as extreme weather increases in the West. The other thing is, while we were talking, I found a count and that all states do, called the point in time count for homelessness, and I know they do that by county. So that might not be exactly census tract level, but Washington Chamber of Commerce has that data, and I'm sure you all have already seen that, but just as another way to access homelessness figures and add that data if you can. Okay, that's
Yeah.
it.
Thanks, Elijah. Yeah, that one we looked at. Yes, we're aware of that one. Thank you. It's just this. It's not available by census tract. We're trying to stay at that geographic location, and I want to say, Robert, you're going to hate me. I'm going to have to ask you again. Is it had to do with the age? Some of that was just like measured in like 2017, and some of it's very dated.
Yeah, it does depend on the source, where it's published. There's the state source for it on the state websites, which I think is more up to date. But if you go to like the actual regional counties, they have like their own postings, and I found one that was back in 2017 was the most recent that they published. But I do think that like the state level one that aggregates, I think all the point in time counts, is more recent.
Yeah, I'm interested to hear anything around data. I don't want to shoot down any data. I won't. But I'll just say we did look at that one, and we just felt that was a little too dated and not the exact right geographic location to use for this analysis. But the idea that you put forth about like homeless shelters, I think that there might be something there. It might be on. We'll take a look at that one. Thanks, Elijah.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for all your work on this. Yeah, it's very comprehensive. Appreciate it.
Thank you for the question, Elijah, and for the commentary. I'm glad that there's some data sources that we're thinking about that we have not previously talked about that there might be something there. So I'll move us to the second question, which is, do you believe that the expanded vulnerable area, and we can jump back to that slide after we ask this question, we posted in the chat, reflects locations that are disadvantaged? And we'll pause and allow folks to think about that question, and then we'll move back to that slide. Thank you for putting that up, Tag.
Hey, this is Charlie again. Not being a Pacific Core customer, so I guess I can't speak to being a community member of these census tracts and communities within the state. My first thought was that seeing the slides that showed the expanded set of named communities beyond just what was identified by highly impacted communities, and seeing how many more customers are captured through this methodology as well makes me think that it is more inclusive of vulnerability factors. So I guess my answer to that would be yes. And, caveat of what we were discussing before, like, are there a couple extras that we could include, that we want to include? Even if the answer to that is yes, I think that the methodology right now is still, like I said, more inclusive than just HICs alone.
Thank you, Charlie. That's helpful. Lee, do you have any comments back for Charlie?
Just thank you.
Any other comments on this, the inclusivity, exclusivity? Okay. And as Lee said, there's also an opportunity to provide feedback after the meeting. So as you digest, there's this, as one of my colleagues would say, this is not the last bite at the apple. This is as we continue working through this large thing to understand. So our third question is more general, which is, do you have other feedback you'd like to provide, or is there another place that we can dig into? Either go back to some slides that Lee's already covered that you might have further questions on, etc. So I'll pause here and see if there's other feedback or anything else folks would. And that's okay. So while people are thinking, why don't we jump to the next slide and we'll talk about this post-engagement survey that we've got here. Thank you, Morgan, for placing it in the chat. So we understand that as we facilitate these discussions, that people process information differently, and sometimes folks want to come back to a thought or review the slides later this evening or tomorrow or later over the holiday weekend or next week and provide feedback. So this link just links to a few questions that we'd like you all to respond to for participating to help us understand, A, is the quality of the information that was provided today helpful? And then what other feedback do you actually have? And if you have none, that's okay too. But we think this is another methodology for us getting additional feedback as we go through these workshops. We'll be reviewing that data as it comes in and passing it over to Lee and Robert to ensure that there is an opportunity to incorporate those as we move forward. Lee, do you have any comments on this survey or feedback methodology?
I don't. Just yeah. Any ideas you have, we're eager to hear. So let us know if we're doing well. If there's other things you want to be consider. Anyway, we appreciate any input we get.
Awesome. So we'll just pause for about 30 more seconds. And if we hear no other comments, we can give folks a little bit of time back in their day. I do want to thank everybody for attending today's vulnerable population workshop. I think the comments and questions that we had were really insightful, and we've identified some things that there might be something there, which is a cool thing. And I think the point of us getting together to talk through these. Oh, go ahead, Elijah. I see you. Come on.
Yeah. Hey, thank you. I guess I'm just curious broadly what the next step is for your team and for this data set. after
That's-
you've developed your findings.
That's my, I had an intention to include a bullet to talk about that, or a slide, and I didn't get around to it. But yeah, thanks for the question. So we're definitely going to take this feedback, and we're going to have a subsequent conversation after we've determined how to incorporate it into the the methodology. We're going to, we have to go through all that, and we have to also take the input we received from the survey to make sure we capture all that as well into this next step. And we'll have a conversation to close that loop. I don't know when, it hasn't been scheduled yet, but we're planning to have a third vulnerable population workshop. And then after that, we want to make sure we roll this out in the 25 CEIP. We want to make sure that this methodology update gets incorporated there, and we include it in that conversation or in that filing. So there'll be a lot of work between now and then, once everybody is okay with this approach.
Awesome. Thank you, Lee. That's appreciated. Okay, and with that, we'll close today's vulnerable population workshop. As always, you can reach out anytime and feel free to take the survey. And if you have any questions, please reach out via email. And we're happy to assist. Thanks everybody for the time. Have a great rest of your Wednesday.
Thanks, everybody.